Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling the Book of Mormon.
Ooh, that's a big one.
It is. It's a really important text for members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints,
Mm.
and there's a lot of discussion surrounding it.
Definitely. Lots of different perspectives and interpretation.
Exactly. So we're going to try to unpack some of those arguments and try to understand why this book is so crucial to their faith.
Sounds like a fascinating deep dive.
It is. And our main source material is going to be a talk by Tad R. Callister called God's Compelling Witness, the Book of Mormon.
Interesting choice. What makes that one stand out?
Well, for one thing, he gave this talk while serving as the Sunday School General President.
Ah, okay. So he's coming at it from a position of authority within the church.
Exactly. Which makes his perspective all the more interesting. And I'm also just curious to hear how he addresses those common questions people have, like,
Could Joseph Smith, a young farm boy, really have written this whole book?
yeah, and what makes it so compelling to believers? What does it teach that's different from what you see in other Christian denominations?
All great questions. And Callister starts by using a pretty interesting analogy to describe the role of the Book of Mormon.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the analogy?
He compares it to a keystone.
A keystone.
That wedge-shaped stone at the top of an arch. You know, the one that holds the whole thing together.
Oh, right, right. So how does that relate to the Book of Mormon?
Well, Callister argues that for believers, the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon is like that keystone. It's the central element that supports their entire belief system. Joseph Smith's prophetic calling, the validity of the church.
Whoa, so it's really important to them.
It's foundational. It's not just a book. It's like the bedrock of their faith.
I see. So if that keystone crumbles, the whole arch could collapse.
That's the idea. But of course, not everyone accepts the Book of Mormon as true. There's a lot of skepticism out there.
Right. And Callister actually addresses those doubts head on in his talk.
Yeah, he doesn't shy away from the tough questions.
Like, how could Joseph Smith, with his limited education, possibly produce such a complex text?
Exactly. And Callister lays out some of the main challenges raised by critics. Joseph Smith's age and lack of schooling, the fact that he didn't seem to use any notes during the translation process.
And the book itself, right? It's not exactly light reading.
No, it's pretty dense. It's got all of these intricate storylines, unique names and places, and some pretty sophisticated theological concepts.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
It is. So Callister tackles these challenges one by one. He points out that no one ever came forward and said, hey, I saw Joseph using reference materials while he was translating.
Interesting. So there's no evidence of him copying from other sources.
Right. And he also emphasizes the sheer volume of information in the Book of Mormon. I mean, Joseph dictated the whole thing without any notes.
Wow. That's impressive.
It would be like trying to memorize an entire encyclopedia and just recite it word for word.
Yeah, that seems pretty impossible.
Well, Callister's argument is that it would have been practically impossible for Joseph to have just made it all up.
So he's saying it's too complex, too detailed to be a fabrication.
Exactly. He also points to the theological depth of the Book of Mormon.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the doctrines and insights it presents are really sophisticated and nuanced.
Ah, I see.
And Callister argues that this level of theological understanding goes far beyond what we might expect from someone with Joseph Smith's background.
So he's saying it's unlikely Joseph could have come up with all this on his own.
That's the essence of his argument.
Okay, so we've talked about the historical context and some of the skepticism surrounding the Book of Mormon.
Right, that sets the stage.
But what about the content itself? What makes its teachings unique compared to other Christian denominations?
Well, there are a few key things that Callister points out. For instance, the Book of Mormon presents a pretty unique perspective on the fall of Adam and Eve.
Okay, how so?
Well, a lot of traditional Christian views see it as a purely negative event, the tragic fall from grace and all that. But the Book of Mormon frames it a bit differently.
It does.
Yeah, it presents a more nuanced interpretation.
Yeah.
It still acknowledges the sin, but it also sees the fall as a necessary step in God's plan.
So it's not just about original sin.
Right. The Book of Mormon teaches that the fall was actually essential for human progression. It allowed Adam and Eve to gain knowledge, experience agency, and ultimately progress toward becoming more like God.
Interesting. So there's a positive aspect to it?
Exactly. It's not just about a fall from grace, but also a step toward greater understanding and potential.
Okay, so that's one way the Book of Mormon differs. What are some other unique teachings that Callister mentions?
He also talks about the Book of Mormon's teachings on baptism. It delves deeper into the meaning and the covenants we make at baptism.
Covenants.
Yeah, like promises or agreements we make with God. The Book of Mormon is very specific about these covenants. For example, it emphasizes that baptism is a symbol of our commitment to follow Christ and live his teachings.
Right. So it's not just about symbolic cleansing. It's about entering into a conscious agreement with God.
Exactly. And while those covenants might be implied in the Bible, they're not laid out as explicitly as they are in the Book of Mormon.
I see. It's adding a deeper layer of meaning to the ritual.
Precisely. It's about making a conscious commitment to a new way of life.
Okay, what else? What else stands out to you as being particularly unique?
Well, Callister also discusses the Book of Mormon's teachings about Christ's atonement.
Okay, and just for anyone who might not be familiar with that term.
Sure, the atonement refers to the belief that Jesus Christ, through his suffering and death, atoned for the sins of humanity.
Right, the idea that his sacrifice bridged the gap between us and God.
Exactly. And the Book of Mormon presents some unique teachings about the atonement.
Oh, like what?
Well, for one thing, it emphasizes that through Christ's atonement, we can not only be cleansed from sin, but also become perfected. It goes beyond just forgiveness, you know? It suggests a path to actually becoming more like God.
Wow, that's a pretty significant difference.
It is. It's not just about being pardoned for our mistakes, but about continual growth and progress toward a divine state.
That's a powerful concept.
Mm.
So Callister is pointing to these unique doctrines as evidence of the Book of Mormon's divine origin, right?
Yes. He's arguing that these teachings are too profound, too insightful to have been simply invented by Joseph Smith, a young man with limited education.
He's saying they must have come from a higher source.
That's the core of his argument.
Yeah.
Now, of course, whether you find that convincing or not is a different matter, but that's the gist of Callister's defense of the Book of Mormon's authenticity.
Okay, so we've delved into the historical arguments, explored some of the unique doctrines.
We're starting to get a clearer picture.
But what about the book's impact on people's lives? What about the personal side of things?
That's a great question, and that's actually where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
All right, looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Okay, so picking up where we left off, we've been digging into the Book of Mormon, its history, some of those unique doctrines.
Right. Getting a good overview.
And now I really want to get into how the book impacts people's lives.
It's a good point because for a lot of believers, it goes beyond the historical arguments, you know?
Oh, absolutely. And Callister actually shares a story in his talk about a friend who left the church, but later came back because of the Book of Mormon.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I think it really gets to the heart of why this book matters so much to believers. So Callister's friend had become disillusioned with the church
Happens.
and decided to leave. But then later on, during a time of personal struggle, he felt drawn back to the Book of Mormon.
Okay, so what happened when he went back to it?
He started reading it again, but this time he really focused specifically on the teachings about Jesus Christ. And Callister says his friend had a powerful experience. Like, he felt this profound connection to the teachings, and it really rekindled his faith.
So powerful how those personal experiences can shape someone's faith journey.
It really is. And eventually he ended up returning to the church.
Wow.
Yeah, so Callister uses this story to illustrate a broader point about the power of the Book of Mormon.
Okay, what's that?
He argues that anyone can have that kind of transformative experience if they approach the book with, an open heart
Makes sense.
and a genuine desire to connect with God.
He talks about giving ear to the sweet fruits of the Spirit.
Yeah, I was wondering about that phrase.
It sounds so poetic, right?
It does.
But basically, fruits of the Spirit in this context refers to those positive emotions that believers associate with, like the presence of God or the Holy Spirit.
Okay, feelings of peace, joy, love, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And Callister's saying that those feelings can be evidence of the book's truthfulness.
So it's not just about intellectual understanding.
Right. It's about letting yourself have a spiritual experience with the text.
Feeling it, not just thinking about it.
Exactly. And, whether someone outside of the faith would have that same experience.
Subjective, of course.
It is, yeah. But I think it's important to understand how deeply personal this connection is for a lot of Latter-day Saints.
Absolutely. And this idea of the book as a source of personal revelation, I feel like it ties back to that sword and shield metaphor that Callister uses.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, we talked about that before, how the Book of Mormon is both a defense against doubt and a tool for spreading the faith.
Right. But now we're seeing how it can also be a source of personal strength and guidance.
like a way to navigate your own internal struggles.
It's interesting how that metaphor keeps deepening, right?
Hmm.
At first, it seemed like he was talking about defending against external attacks, but now it's more about an internal battle, too.
It is. It shows how multifaceted the Book of Mormon is for believers.
Yeah. It's historical, doctrinal, and intensely personal all at the same time.
And, even for someone who isn't a believer, understanding that impact can be really insightful.
Oh, totally. It helps us see the world through their eyes.
Exactly. Understand their motivations, their values. And even if you don't agree with the teachings, there's no denying the significance of this book.
It's shaped so many lives.
Millions.
Okay, so we've covered the historical arguments, the unique doctrines, the impact on people's lives.
A lot of ground covered.
Is there anything else in Callister's talk that we should touch on before we wrap things up?
Actually, yes. He brings up this concept of the cumulative effect of the Book of Mormon's witnesses.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of this deep dive into the Book of Mormon.
And we're finishing strong with this idea of the cumulative effect.
Yeah, I'm curious about this one. What exactly does that mean when we're talking about the Book of Mormon?
Well, it's this idea that the book's truthfulness for believers isn't based on just one single thing.
Not just one piece of evidence.
It's the combination of everything, all the different testimonies, the experiences people have had.
And those unique teachings we talked about.
Exactly. All these things pointing in the same direction, like building a case,
Oh, I see, yeah. So each individual element might not be enough on its own.
Right, right. But when you look at the whole picture,
It all adds up.
Callister actually uses the analogy of a rope to explain it.
Okay, a rope.
One strand of a rope you can break pretty easily, but when you weave multiple strands together,
It becomes much stronger.
way stronger. And that's what he's saying about the Book of Mormon. You've got those historical accounts, the internal consistency of the text itself.
The fact that it kind of holds together as a narrative.
Right, and then the personal experiences people have had reading it, like that story about Callister's friend.
Right, right. It's all intertwined.
It creates this really powerful witness, he argues, of the book's truthfulness.
Okay, that makes sense. Of course, whether or not someone accepts that.
That's a matter of personal faith.
But even if you don't share that faith, just understanding this idea of the cumulative effect.
It gives you a window into how a lot of believers approach the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, shows why it's so central to their lives.
And it highlights how important it is to look at the big picture,
Yeah.
not get lost in the details.
Sometimes we miss the forest for the trees.
Exactly.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. The history, the doctrines, that personal impact.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating journey.
And you mentioned earlier that even for someone who isn't a believer, there's real value in understanding the Book of Mormon's influence.
I think so, definitely.
Can you expand on that a bit more before we sign off?
Well, it all comes down to understanding and empathy, I think.
Because this book has shaped the lives of millions of people.
Worldwide, yeah. And understanding its teachings, even if you don't agree with them.
It helps us connect with those who do.
On a deeper level, we can start to see the world through their eyes,
Instead of just seeing them as different.
Right. It helps build bridges.
Absolutely. And on a broader level,
Yeah.
I think exploring texts like this, even if they challenge our own beliefs,
It stretches us, makes us think in new ways.
it can be uncomfortable sometimes.
It can, but it's in those moments of discomfort.
That's where the real growth happens.
I agree. That's what I love about these deep dives.
Me too. Taking that leap into the unknown, exploring new ideas.
Challenging our own assumptions.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So, to our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this journey into the world of the Book of Mormon.
I hope you found it as thought-provoking as we have.
It's a complex text with a rich history and a powerful impact.
And this is just the beginning.
Right. We encourage you to keep exploring, keep asking questions.
See where it leads you.
You never know what amazing discoveries might be waiting out there.
Exactly.
Until next time, keep diving deep.